Hello and welcome to this special town hall event on hybrid warfare of the future, hosted by the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, in partnership with the U.S. mission to NATO. I'm Terry Schultz. I'm your MC today, coming to you live from Brussels, the heart of NATO. And I want to issue a special welcome to all of our participants joining us from around the world and all of you joining us as well. We are going to make this event as interactive as possible. That's the only way to talk about the future. And there are going to be many opportunities for you all to participate. So over the last 6 months, CEPA has led a digital campaign to inspire innovative ideas for how NATO should better prepare for future threats. Now, to bring some fresh perspectives to these debates, CEPA particularly engaged young voices, the next generation security tech and policy thinkers from across European allies and partner countries through interviews, videos, articles, and some fun things like online quizzes and infographics. The campaign has explored what hybrid warfare means, what these threats will look like in the future, and most importantly, what NATO can do about them. So what do we mean when we say hybrid warfare? This term is thrown around all the time. Let's look at what NATO's official definition of it is. They say hybrid warfare combines military and non-military, as well as covert and overt means, including disinformation, cyber attacks, economic pressure, deployment of irregular armed groups, and use of regular forces. Hybrid methods are used to blur the lines between war and peace and attempt to sow doubt in the minds of target populations. In other words, a collection of headlines of the news from every day in these past few months especially. So we're going to be talking about some very, very topical issues. With the advent of these new technologies employed by increasingly emboldened geopolitical rivals, hybrid threats are growing in intensity, and of course they are lightning fast. They come faster than anyone can get ahead of them, and that's one of the biggest problems and the greatest threats to NATO. Today, through our keynotes, our presentations, our panel discussions, and you, our participants out there in the virtual world, we're going to hear how people imagine the future of hybrid threats and how these practitioners believe we can do something about them. We can get out ahead of them. We're also going to be having some polls, having word cloud on what you believe the biggest hybrid threats are, what the technologies most vulnerable to them are, and again, what we can do about them. So we want to make sure everyone is hooked up to Slido. We want to make sure that I too can manage this technology. So we want you to try a test question here just to make sure that you're hooked up. The test question is, what technologies are most at risk of being manipulated through hybrid threats? We want you to choose from artificial intelligence, biotechnology, augmented reality, and autonomous systems. So go ahead and give us your answer and make sure that you are here with us here on Slido. Let everyone answer that to make sure we're all connected, including me. If you're having trouble, you'll see an email address there in the chat, and you can ask our experts how to get you hooked up, because it's going to be very important. We're going to be taking your questions for the panel later on, and we're going to be asking you some polls. So moving on, as you give us your answers there, we are going to first introduce my co-hosts. Now, a very important person here at Alina, the president and the CEO of CEPA. Alina, first of all, thanks for having me at this event, of course, first, and everyone else as well. We're all very excited about it, as we've been discussing. So please start us off, and then we're going to be hearing from our other co-host, Doug Jones, the Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. mission to NATO. Alina?
Well, Terry, thank you so much. I am so excited for CEPA to be partnering to host this incredible conversation, and so wonderful to see you and all of our distinguished experts and panelists that you'll be hearing from later today. I've been looking forward to this day myself ever since we started planning this months ago. This, in fact, marks the 6 months of our Hybrid Futures campaign that we've been carrying out here at CEPA in Washington, but really all over the world, supported by our partners at the U.S. mission to NATO. You know, as an institution dedicated to advancing the work of the Alliance since we were founded in 2005, we're delighted to be part of the debate around NATO 2030. and a strategic review that's helping set NATO's future agenda. I want to say a special thanks to the Chargé d'Affaires, Doug Jones, who you'll hear from in a few moments, his entire team for helping us since the beginning of this campaign. And I also like to thank the NATO Public Diplomacy Division, led by Ambassador Baiba Brage, who we'll also hear from later today for their continuous support of this important work. And of course, I'm so thrilled to have members of our wider SIPA community here, many of our expert fellows, our board members, practitioners, and most importantly, which was the whole purpose of this campaign in many ways, rising leaders from across the alliance. As you know, developing greater preparedness to future threats is a core part of our work here at SIPA. We see ourselves as an incubator for the rising and emerging leaders of tomorrow. And it's obviously become very clear that those rising leaders will need to understand technology and its implications for our ability to be better prepared to address future threats, future challenges, and for our ability to work more closely together to leverage technology to develop a shared strategic approach. I will not say too much except that this campaign has engaged audiences all over the alliance. We've used a ton of somewhat untraditional tools for a DC-based think tank, at least, including platforms like Reddit, and really interesting content, memes, short stories, interviews with creative and inspiring voices, such as those of Max Brooks, and many of those who will be joining us in this conversation today. And I'm so pleased with the engagement we've received from all of these young people, rising leaders from across the alliance, across the world, and the support we've seen from former policymakers as well. And this is exactly what we do to inject new ideas, new thinking into the conversations about our alliance structures and our ability to be better prepared for the challenges of tomorrow. Terry, as you said, today is supposed to be a continuation of a discussion. So I'm so keen to hear from all of you in our live polls. One of them was up already, to engage in our Q&A. I hope all of you will follow and contribute to our work on the future of security and technology. And very briefly, I just want to make sure that I congratulate the winners of our Hybrid Futures contest, all of whom you will hear from in just a few moments. Congratulations, everyone. I'm so grateful you took the time to submit your ideas to these important conversations. Look forward to hearing from you. Before I wrap up, another big thank you to our partners of the US mission to NATO, as well as NATO Public Diplomacy Division, to our fantastic speakers. I'm so excited to hear from all of you. And with that, Terry, thank you for being the wonderful MC and the host of this party we're having online. And let me turn it back over to you.
To be honest, Alina, as you may have heard, when I looked at the agenda, I did tell Lawrence Ferranza that this looks like a party to me and I wouldn't miss it. So that's how interested I am in everything we're going to be talking about here today. And also, Alina, I really want to credit SIPA on this count of bringing in the young voices. Many of us have been covering NATO, as I have, for 15 years or working at NATO. And one of the most inspiring things and also the most illuminating things is to hear from the next generation and to hear what they believe the biggest threats are, not to leave us stuck in our world of traditional threats. And we're going to be hearing so much more about this in this event. So I'm very excited about this. And on that note, Doug, I'll hold you off just for one more minute here to look at our test poll, just making sure we've got people connected on Slido at #SIPA. The technologies people believe are most at risk of being manipulated through hybrid threats are autonomous systems, 45%, way out in the lead. Next comes artificial intelligence, that makes sense, 33%, augmented reality, 14%, and biotechnology, 7%. So I know that some of our future thinkers will be talking about autonomous systems later on in our event, but that's very interesting, and it looks like people are connected. Remember, #SIPA, and I'd also like to remind you, you can tweet at #HybridFutures. Now, Doug, you've been doing yeoman's duty over there at the U.S. mission there. We don't have an ambassador here yet, unfortunately, so that's meant a lot on your shoulders. So more credit to you for also participating here on the Hybrid Futures warfare event and contributing to all the research that went into this. Doug, let's hear some words from you.
Great, thank you, Terry, for that kind introduction, and thanks to Alina and SIPA for putting this town hall together, or this party together, as Terry called it. We'll go with that too. because we're also excited to be part of this conversation. What we're talking about today is really important from our point of view, because the security challenges and threats that the United States and all the allies face increasingly operate in this gray zone, where state and non-state actors are using hybrid tactics such as disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks. And the security environment in which these threats are happening in is also more complex than ever. You know, the days when there was a clear distinction between peacetime and crisis and conflict is largely gone. The times when it was adversaries were clear is largely gone. And also when the conflicts and challenges could be dealt with through purely military means is also in the past. And so we're in a new era, and we're dealing with a new security environment, and we're dealing with new threats that we have to adapt to. And I think if you look at recent events, the Colonial Pipeline cyber hack, the Solar Winds attack, it shows how vulnerable we are to these types of threats and the urgency of confronting them. NATO is often described as the most successful alliance in history. If I was to point to one thing that has made NATO successful, it is the ability to adapt. So NATO would have become a relic long ago if it had not reinvented itself over and over again in its history to adapt to new security threats and challenges, be able to confront them and stay relevant and be able to protect the allies. And NATO needs to do that again today. It started that process. I'd say in this case, probably back in 2015, NATO adopted its first hybrid warfare strategy. Since then, about a year later, we recognized cyber as a domain for NATO operations on the equal footing as air, land, and sea. And by the way, subsequent to that, we've declared space an operational domain as well, as part of the continuing adaptation. And we're really focused these days on enhancing the ways that we can share information as allies, and the way that we can provide mutual assistance to each other, preventing, mitigating, responding to these hybrid attacks and to these cyber attacks. We have a summit coming up, as many of you know. We're about a little over 3 weeks away from the summit. Summits are important points for NATO where leaders come together and make important decisions. And we are working at the moment on the new cyber defense policy for NATO, which we hope will be completed on time, and also renewing the resilience pledge that allies make to each other so we can become more resilient in the face of hybrid and cyber threats. So we can't predict where the next crisis can be, but we can predict that there will be changes, there will be new threats, and that we know that NATO will have to continue to change and adapt. And NATO can't adapt if it doesn't understand the environment, if it doesn't understand the changes, if it doesn't get out of its own echo chamber, as Terry was saying, and hear from people who are seeing what's happening out there. And we can't adapt if we're not getting new ideas and new perspectives. And I think that's what today is about also. So we're really looking forward to the conversation, and thank you again for participating in this.
Thank you very much, Doug. And again, on SIPA's behalf, thank you to the U.S. mission for co-hosting this event. So now, before we move on, we are going to issue our first question for the poll. We would like everyone out there on Slido at #SIPA to tell us what they think the most pressing hybrid threat for the transatlantic community is looking to the future. Would that be cyber warfare, disinformation, automated armies, weaponized corruption, or bio-warfare? Again, read the headlines and take your pick. So as you're inputting your response, and we'll come back to the answers later. But in the meantime, I'm very excited, and I know I'm not the only person out there a little bit fangirling about this. Our spotlight speaker, Nicole Perlroth. Sorry, Nicole. So Nicole is a cybersecurity and digital espionage reporter for the New York Times. She's covered Russian hacks of nuclear plants, airports, and elections, North Korea's cyber attacks against movie studios, remember all that, banks and hospitals, Iranian attacks on oil companies, banks, and the Trump campaign, hundreds of Chinese cyber attacks, including a month-long hack of the Times itself. We hear about many of these attacks here at NATO. Nicole's first book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, about the global cyber arms race, was published earlier this year. And already the book and several of her Times articles have been optioned for television. So we're going to be hearing much more about this. Welcome, Nicole. We're so pleased to have you here. And we're very excited to hear how you, with all of your experience and all of your research, think hybrid warfare might look like in the future, especially in the cyber and digital domains. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you, SIPA, and thank you, Alina. I just could not be more honored to be here today. And I love the angle you're taking with this, with amplifying younger voices in this space, because we need them. There's a shortage, actually, of people working on cybersecurity issues in the United States. And the more we can do to elevate these issues and recruit people to this cause, I think it's just wonderful. So thank you so much for having me. As Doug mentioned, this really couldn't be happening at a more appropriate time. We just had this major hack, ransomware attack on a US pipeline operator. And either because of lack of confidence in the security of their operations, or because they couldn't do proper accounting on their gas flows, they had to shut that pipeline down. And so just over the past few days, we got a very intimate look at what hybrid warfare might look like. An attack that would basically keep people from being able to get gas at the pump, panic buying, uncertainty, the impact to our economy, et cetera. But that's just the latest. We are also still unwinding the SolarWinds attack, as Doug mentioned. I know in Europe, you're still unwinding a similar attack on the software supply chain. And these attacks are not going away. They only are getting to be more frequent and more destructive and disruptive. I have been covering these attacks for 10 years at the New York Times. I'm often parachuting into them. And it was only really in backing up, pulling my head up, and doing my book that just came out, that I was able to really identify some patterns, which I'll share with you briefly today. When I first started at the New York Times, it was not that long before Leon Panetta, then Secretary of Defense, got up on the US Intrepid in New York and warned of a coming cyber Pearl Harbor, some sort of cyber-induced calamitous attack that would cause trains to crash into each other, an explosion of some kind, perhaps at a chemical plant. And at the time, people sort of dismissed those remarks as overly scary or overly alarmist. The fact is that I think we'll probably look back at that speech as rather prescient, but we still haven't had that cyber Pearl Harbor event. And I've always been a little uncomfortable with the analogy because with the case of Pearl Harbor, we didn't see those planes coming. We have seen the cyber equivalent coming for a very long time. But the other reason I'm uncomfortable with the analogy is that it is a distraction from where we already are. And where we already are, at least in the United States, is over the last 10 years, we have witnessed China pillaging our intellectual property through cyber attacks. We've seen Iran emerge as a country that really didn't have very many offensive cyber capabilities 10 years ago, but has now emerged as one of the most prolific actors we see here in the United States. We've seen ransomware come for industrial systems. The Colonial Pipeline attack was just the latest, but over a year ago, there was an attack on a gas compression facility that we still don't know the identity of. We have seen, every possible flavor of attack except for the big explosion. We have seen Russia turn off the lights in Ukraine. And when I went to Ukraine to do my research for the book, what they said to me was, Nicole, we don't think that we were the end target here. We think that we are the test kitchen. We think that Russia has been testing out everything in their arsenal on our systems. And that when the NotPetya attack came in 2017, which wiped out so much of their data and so many of their systems, they said that actually what they thought that was a run to basically erase everything that they had been testing and doing over the previous 5-6 years. And so we also see that from my perch here at the New York Times. We have seen Russia attack a French television station and try to make it look like an Islamic fundamentalist attack. We saw the opening ceremonies at the Olympics in Seoul get targeted. And obviously the immediate suspect there was North Korea, but only later did we find out, nope, it was Russia. We saw a Russian attack on a Saudi petrochemical facility, Petro Rabai, which went so far as to dismantle the safety locks at that petrochemical plant, the very last thing that would prevent some kind of explosion. And obviously there too, the immediate suspect was Iran. But no, later we found out that it was attributed to a Russian graduate research institute. So why is Russia turning off television stations in France and messing with the opening ceremony of the Olympics and dismantling the safety locks at an oil petrochemical plant? Well, I think it's clear that they are playing around with attribution in addition to playing around with their capabilities. Because the fact of the matter is, nation states, sure, they have these capabilities to do substantial harm, but they haven't yet had that geopolitical trigger to actually use the access that they already have to do serious destruction or serious damage, because we still exist in a world with some rational actors that know that the minute they pull the trigger, we could turn around and do the same to them. So instead, what we're seeing is this short of war conflict that's playing out just beneath our noses. And I do think right now is a great opportunity with the attacks that we are seeing right this minute to wake up and recalibrate our focus on defense. And that is where NATO is the perfect platform to discuss these issues. I still think that NATO members probably have some of the most advanced cyber offense capabilities. But offense alone is not going to get us out of this mess. We really need to hone down on defense. And when it comes to defense, we know what to do. We know the things we have to do. We just haven't been doing them. We haven't even been doing the bare basics. It's actually helpful, I think, to look at hybrid warfare through the prism of COVID. We know that masks help. We knew that we eventually would need to get a vaccine, but we also knew that social distancing, PPE, all of these things would have helped us be better prepared. We weren't exactly prepared. And until COVID came out and reached us or one of our loved ones, we weren't even sure whether it was real or really existed. So the same is true in cyber warfare. Until an attack reaches out and touches you, you can't be sure that the threat is real, but the threat is very real. And so I hope that you can take this time to have these discussions and really talk about what it's going to take for people to wake up and do the bare basics, like turning on two-factor authentication, patching their systems, doing patch and password protocol management, and doing secure design. Really before we get to this wave of the Internet of Things and autonomous vehicles, we're already there, but it's not too late to hone in on secure design. And so that is my message today. Thank you so much for having me, and I'll let you take it away, Terry.
Thank you so much, Nicole. It is so useful for the people working in the industries here to hear from someone like you who's done so much research. And just listening to you as a journalist and all of the experiences that you've had, one thing that I realize is that there is not one sector which is free from this cyber attack. We're talking with defense today, but every one of us as journalists have to be prepared to write about our specialty through the prism of potential attacks on it, through possible disinformation, distorting everything that we read, that we think we know. And that should be frightening for all of us, but also, as you mentioned, inspiring for all of us to make sure we're doing everything we can to become well-informed and well-prepared. So thank you so much for all of your expertise. I know everyone got a lot out of it. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.
Oh, I would have so many questions for her, but we're so lucky to have had that opening discussion here. Now I'm going to tell you what you think via our first poll on the most pressing hybrid threats for the transatlantic community looking to the future. Disinformation is leading far and away, 61%. Look at that. Automated armies, nobody's going for that. We'll talk to August about things like that later. Cyber warfare, 27%, of course. We do have the ransomware attacks leading the news these days. Weaponized corruption, yeah. 9%, and biowarfare 2%. So that's really interesting, and I'm sure that Ambassador Bryza will have more to say about that when she joins us later on our panel. So now I'm very pleased to be introducing everyone to this segment that we've previewed now a couple of times, Next Gen Voices, including a special message from the winners of this spring's Hybrid Futures meme, video, and short story contest. Now, remember, everyone out there, you can hashtag Hybrid Futures, but we are going to now hear from the Director of Transatlantic Defense and Security, Lauren Speranza. You've got that big, complicated title now. I've known you since you were here at NATO, and you've been moving up so quickly in this world. So, Lauren, come with us now and help us understand what went into this project. Tell us a little bit more about the contest portion and the winners and what they've got to tell us and teach us all about the broader campaign on Hybrid Futures.
Super. Well, thank you so much, Terry, and thank you for leading us through this discussion today. As everyone has said, I am super excited about this whole project, and why we cooked this up in the first place was because I think this is a broad set of issues that resonates not only with me, but a lot of my peers and folks in this kind of 18 to 35 years old sort of next generation cohort of not just foreign policy, but also rising leaders in the tech sector that are working in Silicon Valley, that are in other kinds of industries that all of these threats have an impact on, as you've mentioned. So really exciting opportunity to try and bring those groups together that don't always have the chance to interact. And so as we have talked about over the last 6 months, we've really put out a variety of content. So some of this has been articles. We did 4 different articles and another to come. We had 4 infographics illustrating, trying to give more data visualization for how some of these threats look. We did an interactive timeline of hybrid attacks to prove that these attacks are already happening and have been happening throughout history, but they've just been evolving with time and technology. We did a Reddit Ask Me Anything with General Ben Hodges and myself. We did an interview with World War Z author Max Brooks. We have this town hall. We'll have a follow-up quiz coming out after this, so I encourage everyone to look out for that. And of course, the meme, short story, and video contest, which I'll get to in a second. But first, I just wanted to share a couple of key takeaways that we took from across the campaign. So the first is in terms of themes. Autonomous systems, AI, biotech, and augmented reality were among the top capabilities that next-gen leaders thought would be manipulated by adversaries in the future. So that's why you saw those as the options in our first poll. Cyber attacks and disinformation were most commonly discussed across the campaign. And I think that shows that our overall literacy and awareness has grown substantially in these 2 areas, but we really need to work on the fact that those aren't the only 2 hybrid threats, that there are tons of other aspects that we also need to be paying attention to, especially while biotech might not seem one of the top priorities now. I think that's one of those areas that could come back to bite us later if we don't pay attention to that. All of the futuristic hybrid scenarios that were described as part of the contest portion featured some kind of non-state actor actually as the perpetrator of the hybrid attacks. But in a majority of cases, there was some kind of connection between the non-state actor and the Russian or the Chinese government. As Nicole mentioned, there were also some discussions about how can we use tech to help attribute these attacks. And so I think that's a huge area for NATO to grow into as well. A single topic that received most attention in the written debates was about the tech arms race between the US and China and how that will spill over into the hybrid competition. There was also a huge interest in how the transatlantic community can use truth and fact to counter disinformation, not by orchestrating disinformation ourselves, of course, but doing a better job of telling our own story and developing a better narrative for us. And there was really an interesting debate about the role of government and people's lack of trust in public institutions to counter hybrid threats, which was really fascinating. And lots of folks felt that this is where the alliance is most vulnerable. And this fed into a broader discussion about whose job is it to protect us from hybrid threats? And that was kind of one of our unresolved questions. And we wanted to take this opportunity now to pulse our audience here in the town hall to share their thoughts on this question. So I'd love to tee up our next word cloud question here. And once again, I'll just ask everyone to see the Zoom chat for those of you in the webinar, to go to the Slido function once again. This one is a bit more of an open-ended question. So tell us in 1 to 2 words, who bears the most responsibility for countering hybrid threats? You know, is it governments? Is it private sector, citizens themselves? Is it institutions like NATO in the EU? So share your thoughts there, please. And we'll come back to that in a second with Terry. But in the meantime, I wanted to return to our contest, which asked rising leaders in Europe to imagine what a future hybrid scenario would look like, and then show us through a meme or a video or a story. So we received nearly 60 submissions with contestants from across NATO and partner nations. These included Azerbaijan, Australia, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Canada, Colombia, Czech Republic, Germany, Greece, India, Ireland, Italy, Lithuania, the Netherlands, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Spain, Turkey, Ukraine, and the UK. We put your submissions to a panel of expert judges that included Benedetta Berti, the head of policy planning at NATO HQ, August Cole, the author of Burn-In and Ghost Fleet, who will join us later today, Jamie Shea, a professor at University of Exeter and former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Threats, Teija Tirikainen, the director of the Hybrid Center of Excellence in Helsinki, SIPA's General Ben Hodges, and Edward Lucas, Marilyn Migra, who's also with SIPA and Estonia's e-Governance Academy, Colonel Brian Michelson with SIPA and also the author of Warbot 1.0, Nicholas Nelson with SIPA, as well as Georgia Tech, and Joanna van der Merwe, who's with SIPA, as well as the Center for Innovation at Leiden University. So as you can see, we brought through people from different backgrounds and different disciplines to help us judge your submissions. And then we put the top 2 in each category to a public vote. And our first place winners were Madeline Olden, a security analyst from Ireland, for her meme about Chinese infiltration of allied 5G networks. Boria Moya, a filmmaker from Spain, for a video about the manipulation of biotechnology and AI to threaten human security. And Pavel Hanasek, who is a journalism student from the Czech Republic, for a short story on AI-fueled bots being used to target NATO officials and public perception. And our second place winners were Ellie Templeton from the UK, who works on cyber at the Geneva Center for Security Policy, for a meme on disinformation campaigns, Tomasz Michalowski from Poland, who works on Java and tech for worldwide banks, for his video on NATO and hybrid threats, and Manea Robert from Romania's University of Bucharest for his short story on an augmented reality app. So a ton of diverse perspectives and thought-provoking things that came out of this, and we hope we can help the Alliance and our policymakers better prepare for these threats in the future. And with that, I just wanted to say congratulations to all of our winners, and thank you to our contestants and our judges. We really appreciate you all coming on this journey with us, and we're so pleased with all the positive feedback. So look forward to staying in touch on all of this. And of course, thanks to US NATO and NATO PDD for giving us the chance to partner on this. And now I would like to tee up our winners' videos so that you can hear a little bit from them for yourselves. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Madeline Olden, and I am extremely grateful to have received the first place award in SIPA's Hybrid Futures competition. I am currently a private sector intelligence analyst at Crisis 24, a Garda World company. Most recently, I was part of Atlantic Council's first cohort of the Young Global Professionals program, where I supported the Transatlantic Security Initiative team. Working at Atlantic Council gave me a lot of exposure to the threat of both Russian and Chinese hybrid aggression. The future of hybrid warfare will be dynamic and multidimensional, and allies need to be preventive instead of reactive.
Hi, I'm Borja Moya. I'm a privacy activist and a filmmaker. Whoever controls artificial intelligence will rule the world in this century. And currently, there is a global arms race to merge biotechnology with information technology. This revolution will have unprecedented consequences for humanity. Right now, global superpowers are working to achieve levels of surveillance autocrats of the past could only dream of having: under-the-skin surveillance. There are grave dangers to global stability and to the loss of human agency from this biotech revolution. This will literally change the world as we know it.
Good morning, my name is Pavel Hanosek and I'm an author of the Hybrid Futures Game of Hide and Seek essay, in which I focus on how the AI will, in my opinion, drastically change the ability to conceal malign activities online. The AI has a steep learning curve, especially thanks to the machine learning that will make it very soon even more challenging to distinguish between human users and AI-controlled bots. NATO's ability to effectively tackle the spread of such networks is in its essence a reactionary effort, depending on the monitoring and understanding the mistakes bots are currently making. For instance, having little information on their profiles. And the NATO should be technologically prepared for such a situation to be able to effectively fight this new generation of AI-fueled warfare.
Many contestants who took part, and several of whom we believe are out there joining us in the town hall today. So I definitely hope we hear more from you later on during the opportunity to ask questions. So now it's time for us to check in with our word cloud that Lauren introduced and see who or what you believe bears the biggest responsibility for tackling hybrid threats. National governments. By far, national governments get the most of these 42 votes I'm showing here. And we know we've got more than 100 people on the call today. So I hope more and more people will participate. So national governments taking the most space in our word cloud. And then the private sector. Look how small NATO is in there. Look, I got a vote, not with my name spelled correctly, but it's nice to know somebody thinks I have some powers out there. So national governments, private sector, citizens themselves, international organizations. Here's another one, all together in a holistic approach, which probably makes the most sense. I am very surprised to see how small NATO is in our word cloud. SHIELD, civil society groups. You can all see that. So the other interesting thing is, though, that national governments together, in the case of NATO, make up the alliance. So that also brings power to the alliance itself, and certainly makes necessary working together and coming up with joint solutions. One thing that NATO has always told us about attacks on on allies instead of on the alliance itself is that it's only strong as its weakest link. So the alliance definitely needs to guard each of its members against these kind of attacks. So now we are moving on to a very dynamic part of the event today, one that I'm taking special pleasure in. And that is our panel, which includes experts across the sectors of policy, military, tech, and the creative community to unpack some of the themes raised by our contest winners and to talk about what the Alliance must do now to address the hybrid warfare of the future. So joining us from just a few miles away from where I'm sitting now is Ambassador Baiba Breise, NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. And down there in Frankfurt, we have Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, CIPA's Pershing chair, and the former commander of U.S. Army Europe, which is where I first met him. And last but not least, August Cole is joining us. Now, he is the author of Burn In and Ghost Fleet, two best-selling science fiction novels about future conflict, which turn out to perhaps not to be so sci-fi after all, as we see how things are going. And August also works with the Krulak Center for Innovation at Quantico. So thank you to all of you for being here. Some of us have been on panels together before, but I'm really looking forward to this one and bringing in the voices of our audience. To all of you out there who are watching, you may now begin to ask questions in Slido. I believe that some people have been posing questions in the chat on the Zoom, and that is not actually where we want to see them. We would like you to submit them on Slido, and that's going to be the best way for us to get them. So moving on now to Ambassador Breise. We're going to start with you to get NATO's view on this. Now, at the moment, the banner article on CIPA's own website is the ransomware attack. And this is something that people can't necessarily predict, and perhaps NATO doesn't have that much to do about it. But the thing about your job, Ambassador Breise, is that you always have to talk about it. Whether or not you're dealing with disinformation, you need to speak about what NATO is doing about all of these different hybrid threats. And I'm not sure if you had joined us yet, but earlier on our question about what is the biggest threat, 61% of our respondents said disinformation, which is right up your alley. So I'd very much like to hear from you on how you think NATO is dealing with this. And one thing we might say about you, you came onto your new job just when the pandemic started. So you've had to be dealing with that, with the disinformation surrounding COVID. On the other hand, you are Latvian, so you may have had a leg up and a head start on anyone who thinks they're going to get it to attack NATO with hybrid threats. So Ambassador Breise, take it away. Please tell us how you think NATO is doing. Give us your own scorecard and tell us whether anything has surprised you in your first year on the job.
Thanks, Terry. Good to see you again. And you were the first one actually to interview me for your radio podcast about a year ago, I believe. Yep. So that was great. I'm very pleased actually to be working again with CIPA, and it's our love to you in Washington, in Frankfurt, wherever you are. You are a great partner to NATO, and the voices like yours, the work like yours, efforts, what you do actually help national governments, help NATO, and help citizens to counter those very hybrid threats that we are all discussing. So it actually helps to bring awareness. It helps to understand what are the best responses, but most of all, it brings our communities together across all sections of our societies. So from one hand, let me say a few words what NATO has been doing and what NATO will do, because I'm happy to say NATO has done quite a lot on countering hybrid threats and also bringing together all 30 allies to increase their level of knowledge and readiness. So, as I said, the first point is about awareness, to understand what is happening to us, the agility, the awareness. And here, what NATO has done in the last few years is actually pretty significant. We have established a new division, Joint Intelligence Security Division. We have upgraded the work of NATO's own information environment assessment capabilities that lies within our strategic communications. Here at Public Diplomacy Division, we have made sure that we increase our readiness in that respect, that we include countering hybrid threats and various scenarios around hybrid in our exercises, be it on cyber, be it on disinformation or telecommunications, undersea infrastructure, and many others. What I'm saying by all this is that actually we have made it possible for the allies to connect the dots, not just because there is a division called, public diplomacy or strategic communications or joint intelligence, but because the allies, by bringing their knowledge and establishing the information exchange and the trust, actually have enabled to have more common understanding of the threats. So the joint understanding of the threats, the joint awareness and agility is a first step in taking action. So next, again, what action do we need to take in those situations, being at the NATO level or being at the national governments or at the private sector? So first, again, exercise, learn, write scenarios, as realistic, but also as unrealistic as possible. Try it out not only among the military, not only among the governments, but with the private sector, with the counterparts in the civil society, with academia, NGOs, media, and so on and so forth. That brings me to the next point. That enhances the overall resilience of our societies. And what that means is, again, not only the awareness of the threat, but actually having the skills, having the tech, having the knowledge how to respond in those situations. When we speak about the responses, that is, of course, the most difficult part. And as we saw quite recently with the wide-scale cyber attacks in various countries, there are possibilities to take action. To go after the servers in certain places, to go after the hackers that we know of, after the hackers that we see of, after their, at the end, those are all humans. Yes, it takes time to attribute and to discover that, but it's possible to do that. And in that respect, there is a toolbox that we can work together on. There's a toolbox not only countering the hybrid threats, but also, within the hybrid threats, whether that's again disinformation or other parts, where we need to collaborate, we need to share information, and that's again not only among the allies, but among the private sector, with governments, with civil society, with academia. And that is a sensitive part. That is the most difficult part, the taking countermeasures and actually collaborating across all these sectors. For NATO, in that respect, it's slightly easier because, of course, our counterparts within, be it European Union, be it within US institutions or other institutions, we do that on an everyday basis. We work with them, we collaborate, and we exchange information, but also lessons learned and instruments that work and which don't work. Now, for example, on disinformation, obviously, it's very important to also understand that the practical action that needs to be taken is not just one sort of single step. We need to invest in our ability to actually communicate. And again, that concerns both understanding our publics, so be it through audience research or the big data, the artificial intelligence capabilities, to have that understanding what our audiences see, perceive, understand, and where our communications land. It needs, of course, the investment in technology. It needs investment in digital outreach, because for most of NATO's 1 billion citizens, it will be digital NATOs that our citizens will know, and also for the rest of the world. So, for example, at NATO, we significantly invest in our digital capabilities and outreach, but also face-to-face engagements, and that's where COVID has been pretty dramatic. We barely meet people outside our bubble, and we do hope that this will restart, because to have those meaningful conversations, to actually have that two-way communication, not just speaking to the screens, we need face-to-face engagements. And here our think tankers, our universities, our academic institutions, but also media as a credible source comes in very strongly. Of course, when we look at the other side of countering disinformation, what the potential adversaries are doing to us, I think our audiences currently have pretty good understanding of what Russia or China is up to. But when we look at the second sort of level and iteration of that disinformation, that is largely promoted through national bubbles, through national sources in our countries. And this is where the challenge lies. And this is, again, for governments, essential that the private sector, be it on cyber defense, be it on communications, be it on other hybrid issues, that private sector is fully on board. And the overall resilience of the societies, and that will be one of the outcomes also of the summit, as we expect, the enhanced resilience of societies of our countries, is very important, because the hybrid threats, what they affect is the speedy decision making, the ability to define what stage are we in. Is it peace? Is it crisis? Is it conflict? And it very much is a question also at the national level. So again, a bit of the lengthy intro, but again, to say that NATO is fully aware, and we also take action in various aspects, including by bringing the 30 allies together and enhancing their readiness, their ability to respond, their resilience, and doing it together.
Thank you very much, Baiba. Were you as surprised as I was to see the NATO so tiny in the word cloud and national government so big? Did that surprise you, just in a word or two?
Well, one lesson learned from the toolbox is that the best response actually to an attack, be it a disinformation attack or cyber, is actually a local response. The proximity really matters, and the speed. So if we have actors locally who are able to respond very quickly, who have that understanding and are able to right away limit the damage, it's the best situation. So whether it's national governments or it's a private company or it's a bigger media organization, everybody has the right and the need to respond.
Absolutely, and something that I work a lot on and find is so important is the citizen response. And when it comes to disinformation, training people to be media literate so that they are the first line of defense, and it never gets further than engaged and well-informed citizens. But that's another panel. I'm going to move on to
just adding to that. You are totally right, Terry. And in that respect, we actually have worked with a number of smaller companies, with the startups, with smaller tech companies, experimentation companies, both to find the tools that work for understanding in terms of information environment, but also countering, countering disinformation games, and similar. So I'm very pleased to say there is such a richness out there in our societies that have that citizen type of response to all the challenges.
Absolutely, and I hope we'll get to talk more about that. General Hodges, this transitions into my question for you. Is NATO, are NATO governments doing enough to train, to equip their militaries against hybrid threats? Of course, you're out there exercising to make sure that your tanks work together and can get across national borders, your specialty. But I recall a case where NATO's own sort of white hats launched a honeypot exercise to see if they could lure in soldiers serving in a NATO country. And it worked like hotcakes, unfortunately. So this was just within the last few years. So are NATO militaries being trained enough to deal with this humongous range of hybrid attacks?
Thanks, Terry. Well, no, it's not enough because it's never ending.
Yeah.
But the best organizations are learning organizations that are able to adapt. And I love hearing Biba speak. She represents NATO, our great alliance that has adapted so quickly to this threat. And this is the future. And so we're going to have to continue to adapt as our adversaries deploy new and more challenging tools, such as what we saw with the shutdown of the pipeline in the eastern United States. But that should be yet another wake-up call, how vulnerable we are. The Defender 21 exercise is a great opportunity to practice moving across Europe. And one of the things that U.S. Army Europe has done and what NATO has done is use multiple seaports for this so that we develop redundancy and depth. We have to assume in a crisis that one or more of the seaports that we might want to use will be shut down the way Maersk was shut down about 3 years ago by the NotPetya attack. We can't assume we're going to be able just to sail up to Europe and then move across Europe. So these kinds of exercises are part of that. Another thing that gets trained up, which is important, is the resilience of host nation support. German rail workers, Latvian power generation, Polish air traffic control, all of these things are national host nation support capabilities that the alliance depends on. All of them are, of course, vulnerable. So the exercises, the huge amount of money that we invest into exercises like Defender 21 are part of that train up. Now, you used a great example. I will say you mixed about 3 metaphors there, but I knew what you were trying to get to. Honeypots and hotcakes, but but we used to do the same thing, or we still do at U.S. Army Europe, where my signal brigade commander or the chief of intelligence would reach out and do these kinds of things to see if people are paying attention. And then, of course, it was self-contained, and then we would name and shame. We would post for the commanders, all right, the XYZ regiment, you had 27 violations, and so it was used for training. And I think that's what you've got to do to help young soldiers as well as old soldiers like me who might not be quite so tech savvy and realize how you can metaphorically leave the gate open and then the enemy comes in because of being lazy or just not following proper procedures. So long answer to a great question. No, we're not doing enough, but yes, we are in fact doing it.
Worked like hotcakes maybe didn't work, but you know the honeypot example I'm talking about. Soldiers literally left their posts or told random people online where they were, and it's shocking. And that report is online for anybody to see, and it's really interesting reading. Thank you, Ben, and we'll definitely get back to you on this. But moving ahead to August Cole, who probably has more imagination than all the rest of us put together, because his books are, of course, about future hybrid warfare. But August, I'm just wondering. Is it any longer science fiction? We see this kind of attack moving and evolving so quickly. Have they even outpaced your fictional World War III scenarios?
Well, Terry, thanks for the great question, and this is an excellent panel in the conference so far. Is tackling one of the biggest, I think, challenges that not only NATO but of course the member states face. Where is hybrid warfare going? And what is the role of technology? And to your point, we are only limited by our imaginations in considering that. And in fact, I think that is the same approach that a worthy adversary is going to be taking too, right? Creativity has everything to do with how hybrid warfare is effective. And in many cases, its roots really are in using narrative as another tool in a aim, in the strategic toolkit. When you look at really the major technological drivers in the next 10 years and into the 2030s, I think too, but particularly the next 10, the power of autonomy and the family of AI software as it starts to transform societies in Europe, in the US and in other parts of the world, we're going to be really seeing some step function capabilities that have the potential to do great things. It also has the potential to introduce new vulnerabilities, the kinds of vulnerabilities that hybrid warfare tactics are effective at exploiting. And so as we look at this next wave of hybrid operations, I see a lot of it focusing on exploiting actually this notion of human machine trust, and maybe more importantly, human trust in this era, where you're going to see a lot of stress on the tenets of capitalism because of AI-driven commerce. You're going to see the social contract being reimagined in across Europe. You're going to see a lot of points that not just an adversary like Russia, but small non-state groups too can now target not only individually, but individually at scale because of those self-same technologies. And so it's a really interesting policy challenge. How do you essentially limit your imagination? Because everything seems possible. And I think one of the really important things is to think about the human effect. I mean, the Colonial Pipeline hack is a perfect way to understand this. Yes, it is a discrete cyber attack on IT systems. However, it is as important as a vector for understanding human behavior when you have acute crises in kind of basic goods, right? Like the mapping that can be done from an attack like that to understand which parts of our population in the US are vulnerable to that sort of disruption, who's filling gas in like plastic bags and styrofoam coolers in their trunk, allows you to better understand where are the sorts of parts of a population you can begin to mobilize in the event of something like a larger conflict or even, again, a kind of more subtle campaign. And that data, that ability to understand that disaggregated collection of information can be put together to shape something that's far more strategic. As Nicole said, this effective testing of tactics globally by a country like Russia. But again, I think it's important to look more broadly too at who else might be interested in such approaches. Really, calls forth like a whole new vision of what conflict is going to be like. I mean, one of the ideas that's been rattling around in my head lately is, why are we still fighting wars with weapons, right? I mean, that's a very kind of heretical, open-ended question. But I think it's a really important one, especially in the spirit of this whole project, which is looking quite broadly at new voices, at unorthodox approaches. And I think we have to be open to them if we are going to have any kind of resilience in a societal sense, in a NATO sense, against the kind of attacks that adversaries are working up. There's a specific aspect too, I think, to this next phase of the human experience around virtual and augmented reality. And being able to put people in immersive environments in the commercial and civilian world is going to open up a whole host of new vectors in attack approaches. And we're lucky because we have a preview, right? Like social media on your phone is effectively a form of augmented reality. For some people, I'd say it's an alternate reality. That allows us to get a bit of a head start and start to develop the kind of playbook that can allow us to invest and prepare accordingly. And so, I say in a lot of my talks, I'm an optimist who stares into the abyss, but these kinds of exploitations of societal division by algorithmic tools is incredibly worrying. And it's one of the things that really does keep me up at night. Thank you, Terry.
Thanks, Augustin. That's definitely something that NATO works on. But I wanted to ask you, when you said that that people needed to think ahead, and could anyone have prevented the Colonial Pipeline attack? I mean, because we had these NotPetya and other smaller ransomware attacks, did somebody not read a memo somewhere that could have stopped this? And I would point out that not a NATO country, but a European Union country, Ireland, right now, the entire health system is shut down because of a ransomware attack at the same time as the US was dealing with this. So there are real life and death consequences, not merely inconveniences of not having gas for your car for a few days. These are really, really frightening and getting more so. Are they preventable, these ransomware attacks? I mean, in your imagination and in your research, was there a way that this could have been cut off?
Sorry, Terry, I was having an audio issue. I didn't realize it was directed at me. Yeah, I think these attacks are going to be persistent, and the types of education campaigns that are really helpful in getting people to understand the implications of individual decisions on the collective security are incredibly important. And that's not something you can mandate with a PowerPoint or communicate effectively, with a memo. I think narrative, actually understanding how to put people in those future environments where they've made decisions of consequence that have potentially strategic ramifications is one of the best ways to really communicate the risks, to get people to think the unthinkable themselves. All of us are still, of course, living under the tyranny of our inboxes, right? And I think that's a really important status quo, baseline assumption you have to start with, is that people have a very finite amount of attention. So you have to reach them in ways that engage them emotionally. And storytelling is one of the best, technologies, one of the oldest to do that.
So here are questions coming in from our audience. Once again, you can send your questions on Slido at #CIPA and tweet about it. Continue the conversation online at #hybridfutures. And this is from a NATO staffer, unnamed. But it may be harder for Viva to answer than Ben. This person says, NATO always seems to be on the back foot. It's not the only one. Is there any sentiment in Brussels willing to endorse acting in a more offensive manner with regard to hybrid actors? And that's something that we do talk about at NATO all the time, including with regard to cyber. That was, I think, one of the cases where it was discussed at length about whether an offensive attack would be proportionate to a major cyber attack. So perhaps Ben and Viva, those are more directed to you. And Ben, especially now that you're out of the service, do you think that much like the name and shame tactic, would it be in NATO's interest to become more vocal and more vociferous in its response?
Well, first of all, I challenge the assertion by your questioner that NATO is always on the back foot. That's just absolutely not the case. But let's set that aside. I thought it was important last year when Secretary General Stoltenberg started talking about and built consensus towards the idea of a cyber attack could be considered within the framework of Article 5. This was a significant forward-leaning policy decision supported by the nations. And that's an important part of deterrence when potential adversaries realize that the alliance could in fact respond in such a big way. But August did a nice job of accurately describing the challenges, but the point he made that this is going to be with us for as long as any of us are alive. You have to learn to fight through it. I mean, militaries fight through bad weather. The Navy fights through, continues to sail and go underway when there's terrible storms. We have to assume that transportation infrastructure, communications networks are going to be intermittently shut down, but yet you still have to accomplish your mission. So what the alliance does and what our nations are doing through training, of course, is building up redundancy, building up resilience so that you can, in fact, deal with it, not quit like, oh, hell, all of our computer networks have been shut down. I would say one last thing that would be impressive to me is if the alliance said, you know what, any investment towards cyber protection of critical infrastructure, that should count towards 2%, because the alliance depends so much on the Port of Bremerhaven, for example, or Polish rail networks, or Romanian seaport like Constanța. The investment in protecting them from cyber or from hybrid attacks, to me, that's like buying air defense systems. It ought to count towards 2%, and that would incentivize.
Yeah, certainly. You've always been one of the creative thinkers about 2%. And now finally with the Biden administration, they have said they're open to discussing how perhaps to reconfigure what counts as your investment in your own militaries coming under the NATO goal. Viva, did you have anything to add to that on the potential of more offensive and not just reactionary, as Ben mostly described, offensive attacks by NATO? I know it's a very sensitive subject.
It is a very sensitive subject, but it's no coincidence that cyber, of course, has been recognized as a domain, the same as land, sea, water for NATO. So cyber, the space, both are the new domains. And Article 5 indeed applies to that. Having said that, obviously, the cyber offensive operations, as you rightly say, are very, very sensitive, and I would not want to go into that field. But let me just say that we know that allies do have quite serious and significant cyber offensive capabilities, and it's possibly not known to the publics in which cases they could have been used or have been used. But what NATO does is, of course, again, brings the allies together to make sure that the investment in our own networks, investment in national networks, the knowledge, the skills, so the human factor risk is decreased, that decision-making is there, awareness is there, but also that then nationally allies can proceed to enhance their own, not only around the critical infrastructure, but again, working with the private sector and with other actors. The challenge, as August rightly said, is always the human factor. And again, here for the military side, as Ben rightly pointed out, our militaries have done quite a lot and are most serious around the cyber defense, because making it more difficult, making it, again, imposing costs of trying to penetrate, or trying to hack, and then again, having the ability to respond and impose the costs afterwards is something that we have to aim at. So we turn the whole conversation to cyber, but we can say the same thing about the disinformation and hostile information attacks, or the subversion, or the, again, you know, the communications infrastructure. There is a whole set of issues. And again, we have the possibility to respond. And if it's not at 30 by the North Atlantic Council, then the response locally, quickly, speedily is something to apply.
So here's a question that it's quite interesting, since we're talking about or since you mentioned that NATO has responded and we just can't see it. I mean, because of course you can think about, you know, the enhanced forward presence being such a deterrent, or being aimed at deterrence. If you can't see the defenses that NATO are building up, then perhaps doesn't have such a deterrent effect on actors. But here's a question from one of our audience: how should we think then about conventional capabilities in the context of hybrid warfare? Because the Russian buildup on the Ukrainian border made everyone nervous, not because of hybrid, the questioner says, but because of the tanks moving. So are we overstating hybrid threats? Yeah, take that from maybe August. Go back to you. Do you have a thought on that? Because your books take place in the future, but do conventional weapons have a place in that future warfare that we seem to be zooming ahead towards very quickly?
Conventional weapons do have a place in future warfare, and many of the maxims, though, about their use, will remain true. Like such as, quantity is a quality all of its own, except, the way we envision what that quantity looks like. 1,000 drones that are the size of my thumb, is a different expression of that versus, 2 battalions of tanks. This holding in tension, right? These different aspects of warfare is a really difficult thing to do, because of course you have to train, equip, and pay for it. And I think NATO is making some interesting steps, in the last decade. In 2016, cyber is an operational domain. 2019, space. Hybrid, I think, poses another challenge too, and this is related to some work I've done for NATO Innovation Hub on whether there should be a 6th domain. Should there be a cognitive or even a human domain that allows for a different way of considering this very question of when Russian tanks are on the border, in what domain will a conflict, for example, take place? Because, it is going to be this aspect of both simultaneity, but also almost like having different elements out of phase. That is going to be, I think, a paradigm, and being able to use that timing, right, for strategic advantage if you're an adversary to get the effect you want. I mean, one of the first reactions I had a long time ago to the Crimea campaign that the Russians were conducting was, it was a bit like almost like watching a stop motion film from the dawn of photography and cinema. That you were looking at something that on its own in one frame told you one story, but then when the frames were seen in sequence at high speed, it looked like something else. And I think that kind of way of considering what we're heading towards in the 2020s and even 2030s is really helpful.
But, and also I would add to the question and then let the others address this. It is not only the tanks on the border. When we look back at the buildup to what the annexation of Crimea and of course then the intensification of conflict in Donbass, the disinformation campaigns were humongous in relation to that. So I don't think you can say it's only tanks moving toward a border that makes people nervous. It's also how the ground has been softened up before that, and the disinformation that continues coming out. But who wants to hear from me? Nobody. Ben, do you have anything? Being an old Army guy, do you have anything to say about perhaps the conventional weapons getting aged out?
Well, I always want to hear from you, Terry. But hey, look, August is right. The steel that the Russians used, that is a part of hybrid warfare. Hybrid does not exclude the use of conventional weapons. What it does, it extends the range of capabilities that might be employed in the what really is the Russian way of warfare. What got people nervous was endless video of trains loaded up with armored vehicles, convoy of howitzers moving across that big giant illegal bridge over the Kerch Strait into Crimea. People were breathlessly watching, where's the Russian airborne brigade that's normally based up in Pskov? Where is it at now? These are all very conventional capabilities, but it's the combination of that with the outright lying that comes from the Kremlin on a routine basis that makes people uncertain about what's going on. And even with all of our technology, where we can track individual people and vehicles, what we have not been able to figure out yet is intention. And so I think there is some in the future with quantum computing, and I'm going to give away, I'm a very simple infantry soldier here, but the idea of quantum computing, I think, gives us a chance to eventually figure out what intentions are, just the way the business world tries to use quantum computing to see into the future. I think you run 8 million cycles of what Vladimir Putin has done in certain situations, and we begin to be able to figure out what his real intentions are. The problem, and this will be my last point on this, is that Berlin and Paris and unsurprisingly London were so willing to completely believe, and Brussels, that when Minister Shoigu said, okay, exercise is over, everybody's going back to barracks, that there are people that actually believe that. This is part of the hybrid warfare when the Minister of Defense of a great nation just tells a gigantic lie to the whole world. And I could hear here in Frankfurt, I could hear the sighs of relief all the way from Berlin of like, whew, okay, crisis is over. No serious-minded person should think for 1 second that the crisis is over. Is a pause. The Russians have set the theater with all this stuff to get ready. This is part of hybrid warfare.
Indeed. Baiba, this is a question directly for you. Who is developing, funding, and when will an information-centric strategy be distributed, which will empower NATO partners and allies? You may describe again some of the efforts you already have underway. And combining a second question with that, keeping in mind that disinformation is a potent hybrid threat, is it not important to consider the homegrown right-wing groups as dangerous as Russia and China? And that's something that NATO doesn't talk about a lot.
Can you repeat the first question?
Sure,
there was part that I didn't hear.
The question was, who is developing, funding, and when will an information-centric strategy be distributed, which will empower NATO partners and allies? I mean, I think that's something that you will say your office is working on all the time.
Thanks. First, let me also touch upon the actual military capabilities, and of course, there is no contradiction between countering hybrids and actually having an effective and efficient deterrence and defense posture. We need both because the times have changed, and we have to have that capability in terms of having actual military investment, and those be it planes or ships or tanks or rockets to actually show that we are serious about our defense. We can't stand with dust shovel and shows that we are serious about defense and deterrence. So it is indeed necessary to invest, but as Ben and August said, very much the hybrid campaigns come together with any conventional action nowadays. So we need both. We need the ability to see and understand the hybrid campaigns, but we also need the capability to deter and defend if and when necessary. So, for example, capability like the AGS, the Global Hawk that NATO has developed and is pretty recent, gives that additional situational awareness to actually see and understand what is happening. But they also need capability like what we do at Strategic Communications, to have the information assessment, to have to see how, for example, Russian communications land during the activity, destabilizing activities that they did recently around Ukraine. And it was very clear that Russians were portraying NATO as an actor, and they were very much launching an anti-NATO propaganda. But it was not landing well in Western audiences. It was only meant for the Russian language audiences and Russian audiences. The same as portraying Ukrainians as very dehumanizing the type of people. So it was a way also for us to see where the intention lies in that respect. And also a little bit more on that, it was quite remarkable that as soon as the decision or the announcement on partial troop withdrawal was made, we could see that these anti-NATO narratives moved to something else that was more around Afghanistan, there was more around the steadfast defender and other exercises. But that was the difference with 2014. That we didn't have in 2014, where Russia propaganda outlets were using NATO as a target and as an actor. Having also said that, we do expect that this is not going to disappear. We saw that activity also last August, September, October around Belarus protest time, when there was a conscious sort of campaign again to use NATO as some type of actor against which Russia and Belarus needed to mobilize. We also assess our communications, and we were quite okay. We can't say always that we are happy or pleased or something, but it was good to see that our communications were landing well in our audiences, and that indeed our messages and communications were heard and seen. And that is part of the deterrence. We communicate, we are fact-based, transparent, but we communicate about what we do, what we deter, what we defend, around our exercises, around our capabilities. So this is also a hybrid tactic on our side. So strategic communications for NATO is both the military and civilian capability, and we use that for all three core tasks of NATO.
And that would answer one of the questions.
On the infocentric strategy, as you said, I think from my explanation, it's quite clear that we have that already. We have the annual communication strategies that is for allies and for the alliance. We are guided by our political decisions from the summits, from the NATO ministerials. And my task is to really, and the leadership task is to keep investing in people, in tech, in capabilities, in the really high skilled and knowledgeable both tech and people.
And that would be an answer to one of the other questions about how do we build democratic resilience? From the practitioner side, it's by putting out facts and figures that support your own positions. But I want to move now, because I feel like we've been giving Russia way too much attention, and it certainly does not have a monopoly on hybrid warfare tactics. And to be a bit conventional and to go back to August, your World War III scenario is US, Russia, and China. And Ben, you've been saying for years that you're worried about how much closer a potential conflict with China is coming. So following on Nicole's comment that China's been pillaging our systems for years, and perhaps we weren't paying enough attention, August, has that been the fact? I mean, have we really sort of undervalued what China is doing and underprepared, underworried about it? And where does that leave us now with NATO only starting to talk about China in the last couple of years?
I think there's been a consistent underappreciation of not only the potential risk, but also the competency of, Chinese PLA and intelligence services. And of course, in the small core communities that are especially obsessed with them by design, I think there's a very serious preoccupation. But in the larger conversation, no, I don't think so. And of course, the strategic relationship with China is complex because of our economic ties and its regional relationships with its neighbors. But that's also a space that NATO can't be afraid to wade into, especially if it is going to maintain a strong U.S. relationship and continue to prove, I think, that relevance. I mean, the transatlantic dynamic between the U.S. and NATO, I think, has a clear narrative. But NATO is a global alliance, even if it's European focused, and because our interests, in the U.S., but also from a European point of view, of course, include what happens in the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific. And so, this has this technological aspect, of course, in terms of, protecting IP that's defense and security related, if not for economic advantage, but also really understanding the same tension that's at work in Europe about NATO's identity as a defense or a security alliance. It can be both, of course, but how does that partnership in Asia work as well? Because countries there have to both trade and coexist in missile range, effectively, of China's shore-based systems, but also understanding that their economic and to some extent political futures depend on threading that needle. And so this ability to conceive of conflict that's not just a simple retelling of the Second World War and seizing islands, but something that's far more nuanced and complex is critical. The last aspect I'd say to that too is that it's okay to talk about conflict with China as being quite far from the Asia Pacific region itself, right? Looking at like the Horn of Africa, looking at other parts of the world like South America, where there are strategic interests, particularly around the Belt and Road type investments that China is making. That may actually mean that NATO nations come into conflict with China in this hybrid sense, far from either of their respective countries. And that is a really vexing problem because we don't have a foreign policy, I think, set up to do that. But in many ways, that may be what's ahead in the next decade.
And Ben, you've been warning about this, as I mentioned, for many years, but not just because of any potential attack China may have on a NATO country, but because a conflict that August is mentioning somewhere else would sap resources needed for NATO to maintain its core tasks, right?
So obviously, I hope I'm wrong, but I do think we're headed towards a kinetic conflict with China in the next 5 years. And it will require most of what the United States has in terms of our great Navy and Air Force and intelligence collection, special forces. And so I think that's why previous administrations and the current administration are so emphatic about a strong, cohesive NATO and a European pillar that could continue to deter the Kremlin without a significant U.S. presence if there is a simultaneous conflict, whether by design or opportunism. Now, again, I hope I'm wrong, but I base this on the lack of a serious response by the West to what the Chinese Communist Party has done against Hong Kong. I mean, not even from Great Britain has there been any kind of a significant response. The Chinese have seen that we, the West, have not done anything seriously to punish the Kremlin for what they've done in the Black Sea region and elsewhere. NATO has responded to make ourselves stronger, but there's been no punishment from Europe or the United States on the Kremlin, not in a meaningful way. And so I think the Chinese see this. I think they see us as divided and weak and with a mess, actually. And I think one of the aiming points of hybrid warfare is to go after cracks in the cohesion of the alliance. Bible talked about at the beginning, the cohesion of the alliance is so important. It is literally the center of gravity. And so if we're going to continue to deter the Kremlin, if we're going to continue to contain Iran, North Korea, and figure out a way to hold the Chinese accountable, it's going to require cohesion amongst all 30 nations of NATO, and that's not a given. Which is why I'm glad that the president has made it so clear that the alliance and allies are an essential part of his foreign policy.
Just quickly, August, is there any country that we should have our eyes on now that everyone's missing as we didn't watch China?
In terms of a contested area, or in terms of a threat?
Potentially the next major actor in terms of being able to launch hybrid threats, for example, becoming a hybrid threat in itself.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about in this to answer this very question is actually not being a country at all, right? The question you asked earlier about tanks versus hybrid. What if an adversary has no tanks because it's not a nation state itself? It's entirely possible with online and algorithmically generated communities to produce the kinds of exploitations of these fissures or cracks that General Hodges was just talking about in not just one country, but throughout, for example, the NATO alliance. As part of that earlier work I mentioned on the human and cognitive domain, I worked on a story about this called In Silico, which was very much about waking up one day to realize that a series of things that have happened in the cyber domain are actually precursors to a sea change in the population sentiment about not just NATO, but about the validity of like the European project. And so suddenly you have nothing that you can do because you can't send a ship, you can't send a missile if you're taking things kinetic. And how do you start to unwind that? How do you quote unquote fight back from something that of course has created a situation in which your own population is the battlefield? It's an incredibly vexing problem and very interesting to explore. And this is, of course, sounding a bit like science fiction, but when you look at what the state of play is today with current social media technologies, mobile devices, and also the data mining and modeling that's going to be happening or is happening, for something as simple as online ads, you begin to see how this can coalesce into the kind of effect. It doesn't require capital, a nation state, to really fundamentally rewrite the rules of warfare in the future.
Well, we certainly saw that with terrorism, but it's exactly the same issue. It wasn't countries, it wasn't governments launching terrorist attacks. It was lone wolves and small groups and ISIS. Baiba, I wanted to have one more question with you before I give a final round to everyone. So let's keep it fairly tight. And that is moving to this question, again, going back to China, but of an unconventional hybrid tactic of Belt and Road. And that was something, again, that I would say NATO woke up to a little bit slowly, to warn countries again to not let key resources, key assets become vulnerable in case of an attack to being purchased by foreign powers. And in Europe's case, it has been mainly China. Do you think that NATO should have sounded the alarm a bit earlier about this when entire ports and air bases and airport landing strips, for example, were being bought up by the Chinese government or Chinese-controlled companies?
I think it was a gradual process of realization, whether the nuclear stations or ports or critical infrastructure objects, were supposed to be owned by foreign countries, and possibly on what basis, on what rules. So actually having to that resilience baselines, that NATO decided, where all 30 allies decided to introduce them, which provides for the resilience of governments, communications, of the health sector, telecommunication sector. It actually also deals with an ownership aspect in critical infrastructure, including in telecoms, 5G, and so on. So again, as with many issues, there is international staff, and there is intelligence part and the public-facing part, and we all put our minds and brains together, and allies as 30 come together and make that decision. So there is a discussion on China, and I'm sure that at the summit we will also see the language in the summit communique that will reflect all allied thinking on China being both a challenge and also an opportunity, which it is. And we need China. If we are serious about countering climate change, we need China on board. There's no way around it. But also, if we are serious about the behavior, the respect of values and human rights, and treating other countries with respect, respecting international law and the rules-based system, also actually to explaining why it is expanding the military capabilities and upgrading nuclear capabilities and so on and so forth. It's part of the behaviors that we would expect and the relationship we would expect from China to be much more open and much more straightforward.
And although I regretfully didn't get to some of the questions on NATO-EU cooperation, this is one of the fields that is, it's absolutely essential, because the EU has the right to introduce legislation, and has in fact done so, to require more scrutiny of foreign purchases. And that again has only happened in the last couple of years. So everyone coming a bit late to this concern. I do have to wrap up now, and I want to give each of the three of you a final question for a brief answer, and that is coming from our audience, something that hopefully we can look up to, and not just think about how frightening this all is, but whether there have been any recent successes that you know of illustrating a good approach to hybrid threats. We'd like to end on sort of anyone have a very short and concise list of best practices. I'll go backwards. August.
I'm seeing a lot more willingness to think the unthinkable and to use these narrative approaches that I'm of course partial to, but I think are actually very effective, not only spreading messages broadly, which is really important, but also reaching the most senior leaders. When you're trying to think about the real world implications of some of these challenges that we're talking about today, you have to start, I think, by holding those two different entities with the same value, because you both need buy-in from people outside organizations, like in the civilian world or NGO world, but you also need the senior leaders within organizations like NATO's or national governments. And so being able to do both, I think, is really effective. We've seen that within NATO ACT, seen it with the Norwegians, the British are working on similar initiatives, and others who are trying to imagine this sort of future that is both cautionary, but also I think aspirational. Ultimately, I don't want people to think about a challenge like hybrid conflict as being unaddressable, because that creates a sort of helplessness and therefore vulnerability into doing something about it. And I think we have, through events like this, through the kind of people who are bringing into these conversations, a real chance at really making a difference. So thank you.
And bringing the young voices, especially, they can think things I simply feel like I can't. I don't even, we don't even know, those of us who grew up in another time don't even know everything that's available, and all the things they will think. I was going to sound like Dr. Seuss there for a minute. All the things you can think. Ben, any great examples of?
You were talking about me when you said young voices. I was really good there for a minute. So two examples, I think, one NATO, one non-NATO. The NATO one, I am so proud of the Czech Republic standing up, in a very firm way, rejecting what Russia has been doing. This probably not real easy for them. And so I think the fact that they have done that, this is how exactly what Barbara said earlier, local responses to disinformation, that's something that had to be orchestrated from Prague, not from Brussels. From a non-NATO standpoint, I look at Finland. What a terrific example of resilience, of whole of government approach to national defense, not just their amazing mobilization system, but ownership by everybody there. A good example for the rest of us.
Definitely, that's true. That's true about Finland, and of course, with the Czech Republic, you mean, for the people who may not have followed the news, the fact that the Czech Republic stood up and identified Russian-linked actors as perpetrators of a deadly blast in 2014. The Czech Republic did, however, ask NATO and EU partners to expel diplomats, for example, to stand up and stand beside them, and that hasn't been taken up with so much enthusiasm. Certainly not like we saw after the Skripal attack, when all NATO countries did expel Russian diplomats, and NATO itself did the same. So there, Baiba, our last word. What are the best successes that you have seen looking out over the NATO landscape?
Across the alliance and across NATO, I have seen much more awareness, much more willingness to actually be ready to talk and be ready to discuss very practical countermeasures. In various contexts, there is a clear understanding that the international law allows that, permits that. So I think that is a qualitative jump and that comes at various levels again as a national. I've seen much more engagement of variety of tools in exercises, be it particular cyber defense exercises or experimentation, future sort of foresight thinking. As Ben said, with the Allied Command transformation there in the US, one of the big strategic commands whose task is to really look ahead, but also integrating that with SHAPE and with our sort of more hardware-oriented tasks. I have seen much more readiness to take on innovative and sort of high-tech artificial intelligence related technologies within NATO, and the whole mindset has changed. That it needs, of course, we also need to adapt our procedures and adapt the whole set of skills and people, and how we work across the headquarters and with the commands on that. And I have also seen practically much more sort of readiness from allies to take on this private sector aspect, to engage with the private sector. And also the same from the private sector, be it, the social media platforms and companies and their sort of understanding, hopefully more understanding of their role in not only serving as highways of information, but actually that they do have some editorial role and that they do have a responsibility for the security and values in our democratic institutions and democratic processes. Because again, at the end, let's face it, without security, there is no prosperity. All these big businesses have been successful because our societies and countries have been safe, secure. And be it NATO, be it EU, be it the whole set of institutions that we have built, they have been the preconditions for having the fact that these companies have been able to become so successful and dominate certain spheres. But also, my pride always is when I look at our NGOs, our think tanks, our academia, our, the journalists, Terry, my respect for journalists as credible sources and, the works they are doing, underpaid, overworked very often. We rely on all of them in this situation. You are as important as the national governments and as international organizations.
Thank you. That's a great way to wrap up and to sum up our takeaways as think the unthinkable and then do what's possible right in front of you together in a holistic way. And our word cloud certainly appeared that our people joining us today think that's the right way to do it, not necessarily at a NATO level, but at a national government and with the private sector. So I'd very much like to thank our panelists. That was fascinating. And I think everyone learned a lot and enjoyed the different viewpoints coming from somebody, August on one side, Baiba on the NATO side, and then Ben always with the unvarnished middle ground there. Thank you so much to the three of you. And we've got one more poll to introduce before we head into our final speaker. We may have gotten a preview of this answer earlier with our word cloud. Does NATO have a role in countering hybrid threats, even when they fall below the traditional Article 5 collective defense threshold? Now, that's an important question. And I know from SIPA's own Lauren Speranza that that's something that SIPA believes should be looked at much more closely, how to respond when it's not an Article 5 question. So I will let everyone answer that while I introduce our final highly respected speaker, our keynote, General Paul Nakasone. Now, he is the commander of the U.S. Cyber Command, Director of the National Security Agency, and Director of the Central Security Service. So we've talked so much about cyber today that we certainly are going to be listening with open ears to the presentation and the thoughts that he shared with us on how the U.S. is preparing for future hybrid threats in the cyber and information domains, which we've spoken about so much today. So General Nakasone's presentation, let's listen to it now.
As the world began responding to the global pandemic in early 2020, a nation-state launched a malicious cyber intrusion campaign, large in scope and undetected for months. Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service had created a backdoor in a commercial software used by governments and industries around the world. When unsuspecting users installed what looked like an ordinary software update, they unwittingly downloaded and installed malware onto their systems, giving the Russians the ability to access and steal information, as well as the potential to alter or destroy it. The SolarWinds breach exposed thousands of public and private organizations worldwide. While unprecedented, this incident is not unique. Our adversaries are operating with a scope, scale, and sophistication that is unlike any we've seen before. Their tactics have evolved far beyond spear phishing and exploitation of weak passwords. Today, our adversaries are targeting and infiltrating our systems by exploiting supply chain or zero-day vulnerabilities. They pose a critical threat to our nation and our allies. Defending against this threat is where we come in. I'm General Paul M. Nakasone, Commander of U.S. Cyber Command, Director of the National Security Agency, and Chief of the Central Security Service. Behind me is our Joint Operations Center, where cyber warriors from U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency work side by side with U.S. and foreign partners to defend our nation in cyberspace. Here on this operations floor, talented teams work around the clock as part of a whole-of-government approach to respond to adversarial cyber activity like the one I just spoke to you about. Cyberspace has created a new strategic environment in which cyber actors can increase their power, degrade the power of others, and gain a strategic advantage. From a lone hacker to violent extremist organizations to nation states, our adversaries are demonstrating a new risk calculus that has changed the traditional threat landscape. By operating in cyberspace, they can cause great damage without ever engaging in armed conflict. They target our economies, our critical infrastructures, and our electoral processes. They steal defense secrets, intellectual property, and personally identifiable information. They launch persistent malicious cyber campaigns to erode our military advantages. And they increasingly leverage social media to carry out influence operations. This is the new era of strategic competition, and the greatest competitive and aggressive threats we face are by two near peers. China poses the greatest potential threat to the U.S. and our allies. It's becoming more assertive economically, diplomatically, militarily, and technologically. It seeks to undermine a stable and open international order to establish its centrality in the global system. China is our pacing challenge. Meanwhile, Russia is a disruptive threat, seeking to undermine the integrity and legitimacy of our political systems. Russia has demonstrated its ability to conduct influence operations in numerous countries, often by combining effective target development with the power of social media. Moving forward, we expect these and other adversaries will increase their efforts in cyberspace to undermine U.S. and allied interests. These malicious actors will continue to identify vulnerabilities in software used across our governments, militaries, and private sector networks. They will embrace common anonymization platforms, generalized toolkits, and open source capabilities. Anything that makes it more difficult for network defenders to detect and attribute their activity. They seek to exploit gaps and seams between government organizations and authorities. And they're able to gain and maintain access in a manner that mitigates detection and response. No matter how good we are, these challenges will endure and will only increase in both scale and scope. We must raise the bar, be resilient, and act. Our adversaries have worldwide reach. They integrate globally across domains, and the consequences of their cyber operations transcend international boundaries. It will take a unified effort, an international community working together to gain and maintain the competitive advantage in this transnational threat environment. Partnership is where our power is. Effective cybersecurity requires continuous engagement to seek advantages and generate opportunities, and partnerships give us the access we need for success. Here at Cyber Command and NSA, we work closely with U.S. government, private industry, academia, and international partners to achieve and maintain cyberspace superiority, build resilience at home, defend forward, and contest adversary campaigns and objectives. One way we do this is through Cyber Command's collaboration with international partners to conduct Hunt Forward operations. Hunt Forward was born from our collaboration with Montenegro. They were facing increased harassment from Russia since joining NATO. At Montenegro's invitation, our team traveled to Podgorica to investigate signs that hackers had integrated the Montenegrin government's networks and to hunt for Russian-backed malware on their networks. Working side by side with our Montenegrin partners, the team also saw an opportunity to improve U.S. cyber defenses against foreign meddling ahead of the U.S. 2020 elections. These collaborative operations defend and harden networks, systems, and critical infrastructure, while yielding insights and intelligence that are invaluable to both the U.S. and our international partners. Through our Hunt Forward operations, we've inoculated millions of systems and reduced the effectiveness of the malware they've employed. Like Cybercom, NSA also has a cybersecurity mission. While NSA's SIGINT mission exploits signals emitted by our foreign adversaries, its cybersecurity director produces keys, codes, and cryptographic devices that make it difficult for our adversaries to do the same to us. NSA's trusted partnerships with the private sector enable the agency to better secure sensitive networks. Thanks to our existing public-private dialogue, NSA quickly identifies and issues advisories on critical vulnerabilities in commercial software that potentially affect millions of users around the world. This enables Cyber Command to simultaneously take action to close the same vulnerabilities on our Department of Defense information network. When NSA issues a public advisory, it sends out an alarm that rings louder than a simple patch release ever could. Most users are aware that they should apply patches in a timely manner, but with updates being released so frequently, it can be difficult to know which ones are the most critical. NSA cybersecurity advisories often attribute nation-state exploitation of known vulnerabilities. This emphasizes the scale of the threat and motivates network defenders to take immediate action. By using social media to amplify these advisories, we have been able to reach an even broader audience. This enables us to build greater transparency and trust with our public and our partners. No one entity has complete visibility of malicious activity across all systems, software development, cloud environments, or network traffic. It's only through this kind of public-private collaboration and collaboration with our international partners that we continue to make it increasingly difficult for our adversaries to operate. Effective partnerships require people with extraordinary skills and a fierce dedication to mission. The combined talent of our worldwide partners is the greatest competitive advantage we have to confront these increasingly sophisticated threats. Organizations like the Center for European Policy Analysis provide us an invaluable forum for sharing ideas and developing talent. I'd like to thank CIPA and the U.S. mission to NATO for their work in putting together this year's event and hosting the Hybrid Warfare Contest. Thanks also to our NATO partners for joining us today and to all the contest participants. I'm inspired to see so many talented individuals submit entries this year. You've tackled some of our most challenging areas: disinformation, cyber operations, autonomous systems, and energy security. Our ability to imagine the threats of the future is key to innovating solutions today. I'm grateful to you all for taking the time to apply your unique insights and expertise to helping our community find new solutions. Thank you for your submissions, and congratulations to the winners and finalists. It's been an honor to speak to you and learn with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much to General Nakasone for taking time to share his perspective with us today and with the entire alliance. So before we finish up here, I want to share your responses to our last question on whether NATO has a role in countering hybrid threats, even when they fall below the Article 5 threshold. And 96% of our 24 respondents say yes, and only 4% say no. So that sort of makes up for the word cloud, doesn't it, where NATO was tiny little letters, and even Terry Schultz was in there? No, 96% say yes, NATO has a role. And one thing I took away from General Nakasone's speech was that partnership is our power, and it's going to take all of us. And I think that's a perfect way to wrap up this co-hosted event with SEPA and the U.S. mission to NATO, and then bringing in a journalist to muddle it all together. I really am grateful for being a part of this, and I hope everyone out there who engaged with us throughout the event enjoyed it and learned as much as I did. And SEPA says that you should definitely stay tuned to their website for more content on hybrid warfare to come over the next month, a few new articles, and a wrap-up quiz. So thank you so much to all of our participants, both those who spoke on our panels, gave our speeches, and those of you who shared with us in the virtual world. Thank you so much for joining us, and continue the conversation online at #HybridFutures, and we'll see you at the next SEPA event. Thank you.